All right, Jim. Well, let's get a few more questions here this week on the show. This one was sent to CornyDriveThru@gmail.com from Jason Primo in Cornwall, Ontario, Canada.
Wait a minute, Jason, how do you spell that?
Primeau.
Primo.
What did I say?
You said Primo.
I apologize, Primo. In a recent interview, CM Punk has said that Bret Hart is truly the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be. He went on to say that Shawn Michaels' stuff does not hold up. I have a quote here. I'll read it to you. This is allegedly from CM Punk. I think Bret Hart is legit the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be. His stuff holds up. I was a Shawn Michaels fan when I was a kid because he did flashy stuff, you know? He was cocky. But some of his stuff doesn't hold up the way Bret's does. Bret is timeless. Bret's is timeless. You know, Bret is, you called it, the excellence of execution. He calls himself that. At the time, it was a cool nickname to me. But now I look back and I realize, man, everything he does is fundamentally sound. Like, he didn't misstep in the ring once. Like, everything he did, there was a reason for it. You watch his matches, you're like, oh, that's kind of what to build my stuff and model myself after. I don't know if that was worded wrong there at the end, but you get the general idea. What are your thoughts?
It's a transcription.
That's right. I don't know if this is necessarily a registered amanuensis, but this is certainly what is sent in by Jason.
What now?
An amanuensis.
Well, you do and you'll clean it up.
All right. Well, you brought up transcription. I brought up amanuensis.
No reason to bring your medical problems into this conversation.
All right.
And I see what he's talking about. We talked about it earlier in this program. Some things last longer than others that are the ECW was a product of the 90s with the grunge and the pop culture and the whole nine. It was tied very specifically to that time period and what was going on in music and pop culture and etc. And so therefore people went crazy for it at the time, but 20 years later, it doesn't hold up as well as we mentioned. And this is not me saying this. This is other people have said this. Whether everybody feels that way or not is different, but a lot of people saying it. Smoky Mountain Wrestling from the same time period as ECW stood up better as a wrestling program because it wasn't tied necessarily to any pop culture or any fad or wave or thing going on. It was pro wrestling with personal issues between people that wasn't necessarily, you know, we got a little topical with the gangstas and etc. But in hindsight, that type of program, much like we were just talking about the Freebirds on Georgia Championship Wrestling, those programs held up better than something that was tied to a fad or tied to the time, because it wasn't. And if you ain't in that time anymore, you don't, you know, you don't necessarily want to immerse yourself in it. So there are some things that in wrestling that are tied to a certain time period. And for the 90s, Michaels was, yes, he wasn't doing ridiculous gymnastics, just handsprings and cartwheels for the sake of it, but he was so athletic, he could apply the flying and the aerial shit and still apply it to his match. He had excellent matches, but if you go back and watch without being in that time, you can see that his shit didn't look as believable as Bret's, which is what we're talking about here. And it was a little more ballet-like and over-the-top athleticism. I've always mentioned the upside down. Ray Stevens did it brilliantly. It looked like he was off balance. It looked like he got hurt. It looked like he couldn't stop himself. Well, Flair took it, and it didn't look like Stevens's, but it still, until he got fancy with it and started going all the way over the top and running down the apron and jumping at whatever, it still looked good. Michaels looked like an acrobat taking the upside down in the turnbuckle. It was all at the same speed. It was fast, but it wasn't violent. And then he started where he would flip back down, land on his feet, and turn around and do something else, and jump down, turn around, pick a bale of cotton, whatever. He started adding shit to it, and it got more implausible. So that was one of those. Well, remember we did a watch along with Shawn Michaels and Vader from SummerSlam '96.
Yeah.
And everybody said what a great match that was. And I pointed out some things that would have made it a greater match if Michaels didn't have his own head up his own ass and wanted to work with Vader like he worked with everybody else. But you could that was a different match than a lot of Shawn Michaels' matches were at that point, because Vader was a different kind of opponent. So he had to dig in a little harder, but still it was prettier. It wasn't as violent. It wasn't as jarring. It wasn't as physical as Bret's style. Now that, to me, I'm not going to agree with CM Punk that Bret Hart was the greatest wrestler ever in the history of the world. But he was obviously.
But he may be the best in the last 30 years.
He might have been, even that, you've got to sit down and look at everybody. But he was definitely, for professional wrestling, and what it constitutes, he was better especially at the little things. He was better at the psychology. He was better at, he had his own patterns too. Bret faults Flair for always taking the same bumps. Bret had his pattern too, but he had more different kinds of matches maybe than Michaels did, who still went back and did a lot of his own stuff too. And you had Michaels' match, whereas Bret would have other guys' matches. So I can see, yes, I agree with Punk that Bret's stuff does stand up better, and for all the reasons I just mentioned. I still don't know, can you say Bret was the best of the last 30 years? Because that takes into account some of Flair's prime also.
Well, not really.
30, 91. Yeah, well, they're...
Not that he didn't have a couple good years and some great matches, but that's kind of the end of Flair on that list.
Yeah, well, then he's closer. Then Bret may be closer up the top.
Jim, CM Punk also did a recent interview where the topic of Hulk Hogan came up. I guess they were asking CM Punk how he compares to some of the big stars, the biggest stars of the past, like Steve Austin and Hogan. And here's his response. I'd like to get your reaction, because a lot of people have asked about it. Throwing my name in the hat with someone like Steve Austin, who is arguably the biggest star the business has ever seen, a lot of this is subjective. You can make the argument that Hulk Hogan is a bigger star than Steve Austin. Then you look at the business periods and eras and box office receipts and all that other stuff. I think Hogan is a piece of shit. So obviously I'm like, Steve Austin, yeah. What it feels like, I don't have the words to describe. I know what I feel like. I want to help everyone on the AEW roster fucking get there. But a lot of people honed in on the Hulk Hogan as a piece of shit and wanted to know your thoughts.
Well, it sounds like from the statement there, and I don't want to put words in Punk's mouth, but it sounds like from the statement there that the context he's making is that Hulk Hogan was a noted piece of shit in terms of keeping his spot, making sure that everybody else was below him, maneuvering side. What are you laughing at? I think it may be more than the backstage politics of Hulk Hogan. Well, no, I'm talking about making sure that he was the center of the universe and that everything revolved around him, and that fuck everybody else, I'm going to get mine first, and etc. Whereas Punk is saying he's there to help the other folks in the locker room. I don't know if he and Hulk Hogan, Punk, that is, have had any personal conversation back and forth, and he just decided, well, he's a piece of shit personally too. That may be possible. But I'm not surprised that he would characterize the Hulkster in that fashion, brother. Yeah, Hulk Hogan then announced that he turned down a chance to wrestle CM Punk, and CM Punk said, what is he talking about?